Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of this year's Sandars Lectures in Bibliography. For those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I'm Dr. Jessica Gardner, the University Librarian and Director of Library Services here at Cambridge. Welcome. Through a generous bequest from Samuel Sandars, this prestigious lecture series has been running since 1895 on the subjects of bibliography, paleography, typography, bookbinding, book illustration, the science of books and manuscripts, and the arts thereof. This year's speaker, running over 3 evenings, is Dr. David Pearson, former Director of Culture, Heritage and Libraries for the City of London Corporation, past President of the Bibliographic Society of London, and Distinguished Senior Fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of London. David's research centres around books as material objects, their ownership, their use, their bindings. He is the author of several books, including the invaluable Provenance Research in Book History, a new edition of which was published in 2019. And in English bookbinding styles, 1450 to 1800, published in 2005 and reprinted in 2014. The subject he has selected for his series of lectures for us is Cambridge Bookbindings, 1450 to 1770. And as we will see and hear, David's research is grounded in the profound and enduring engagement with the rare book collections in the University Library and Collegiate Cambridge. There will be an opportunity after each lecture for questions from the audience online and in person here in Robinson College. And I'm delighted to say that tonight's lecture also marks the publication, David has been extremely busy, of David's new book, deriving from his Sandars research, titled Cambridge Bookbinding, 1450 to 1770. To celebrate this year's Sandars Lectures and the publication of that volume, you are all invited back. Please do come to join us at the Milstein Room at the University Library directly after this lecture this evening for a reception, which includes an opportunity to purchase a copy of David's book, which you must, and also to see a display of some of the very bindings that David will discuss here in his lectures. David, can I invite you to deliver your first lecture, which is entitled Picking Up the Threads? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You haven't heard it yet. Thank you, Jessica, for those exceedingly kind words. I always try to discourage fulsome introductions. You know, David Pearson is a retired librarian who looks at books. You can't, all you need to know. But seriously, thank you very much. And thank you, obviously, to all of you for being here tonight, and to all of you online who I know are there, who I cannot see, who are all the people who make this occasion possible. And thank you very much. The theme of my Sandars lectures is Cambridge Bookbinding, 1450 to 1770, and I'd like to start by outlining what they will comprise and how they will be divided up. The lectures are based on a research project which I have been undertaking for some years with the support of the University Library here, whose main aim is to produce guidance on the recognition and dating of Cambridge binding work of the handpress period. The primary output of that research is indeed this recently published book. There's an example of it out on the table there, on which the lectures will draw. And what I really hope you will do after hearing what I've got to say is to engage with the book, where you'll find a lot more information than I can fit into 3 lectures. It's there that you'll find images not only of bindings and their features, but also of most of the individual binding tools used in Cambridge, a directory of bookbinders, and fuller discussion of the evolution and the relationships of the binding trade here. It's published by the Legacy Press, which I think has set the standard in recent years for books about bookbindings, for the quality of the design and the production. It's a small American publisher, and I'm sorry that Kathy Baker, the publisher, couldn't be here tonight, as she originally hoped that she might be, but I know that she's out there online somewhere. So whatever you think of the text, I think you will have to agree that it's a handsome piece of book production. And as Jessica was saying, I am pleased to say that I have been able to make some copies available in Cambridge at a special discounted price in association with the lectures. And I do still have a few copies available for anyone here. So if you're interested, do please make yourself known after any of the lectures. The book is supplemented by a module in the Cambridge Digital Library with high-quality images of representative examples of Cambridge work from the shelves of the University Library. Additionally, the folders of hundreds of pictures of Cambridge bindings, which I compiled during the project and which contain many more examples than I can illustrate either in the book or here or on the digital library, have been deposited in the UL, where you will be able to consult them as additional manuscript 10546 through the good offices of the special collections people there. So the lectures, key showcase though they are, of the research, are only a part of the whole, and I am hoping that those other outputs will provide a permanent legacy which Samuel Sanders would approve of. The Sanders lectures do have a track record of generating reference works on bookbinding with lasting value, not least G.D. Hobson's of 1927, Basil Oldham's of 1949, Miriam Foot's of 2003, and in that context, I am in quite terrifyingly distinguished company. I have many people to thank here in Cambridge who have made my work possible, but I'll save those acknowledgements, if you don't mind, till the end of the series. Before going any further, I think I should say something about why I have devoted a significant chunk of my life during the last 5 years or so to researching Cambridge bookbindings. And I'll do it a bit anecdotally by remembering an interview when I was on the decision-making side of the table for a distinguished bibliographical fellowship, not a million miles away from here, quizzing a candidate who was proposing to investigate the growth of particular collections around the colleges of Cambridge using the very appropriate evidence base provided by the provenance markings in the books. Were there any other key kinds of evidence that might be drawn upon, I wondered. What I was thinking of were the many miles of books on Cambridge shelves whose covers tell us that they were bound here, commonly in workaday bindings rather than gilded goatskin, but which can often be dated within a couple of decades or even less. Now, alas, that test was failed, but I don't blame the candidate as much as the research culture of successive generations who continue to fail to appreciate the potential of bindings to tell us things which we want to know. It's very heartening for a rare booksman with my kinds of interests, who's observed the evolution from historical bibliography to the history of the book, to see just how much of a journey we have been on to appreciate books, not only as words on pages, but as material objects with individual histories. Philip Gaskell began his well-known and rightly revered handbook, which I'm sure is by many bedsteads in this room as I speak, with a statement that bibliography's overriding purpose must be to determine a text in its most accurate form. But we've moved away from those arid plains of textual bibliography to the sunny uplands of book history, where we're more interested in the social impact of books than the minutiae of authorial intentions. We recognize that books come alive when they are owned and interacted with, and the copy-specific evidence is the window into that interface between books and their users. We pay serious heed to provenance traces in library catalogues and in academic studies. We've adopted the material text as a moniker to bring it all together, and we've developed new research methodologies to explore it all. I remember Dennis Duncan beginning his Munby Fellowship lecture here a few years ago with a quip to the effect that the question today is not who's studying marginalia, but who's not studying marginalia. But I think it's fair to say that bookbindings remain largely neglected and out in the cold in that landscape, wholly wrongly, because they are very obviously part of that material evidence, and indeed the first bit of it that you encounter when you are coming to a book. Bindings, like every other aspect of books made before 19th century mechanization took over, were unique handcrafted objects, and every one tells a story. Throughout the early modern period, they were all made in small workshops like this, where a team of half a dozen or so people worked through a series of standard repetitive processes to turn loose sheets of printed texts into functional codices that people could read and store. I don't wish to bore the many people here who know all about early binding techniques, but for the benefit of those who don't, let me just say that European bookbindings made throughout the handpress era and intended to last generally followed a standard series of construction processes whereby printed sheets were folded, placed in order, and sewn onto flexible supports running horizontally across the spines. End leaves were commonly added at each end to create a kind of buffer zone between the text block proper and the outer covers. The supports were laced into stiff boards for sturdiness and for protection, and they were covered then usually with an outer skin of leather or parchment. The leaf edges were made straight with a sharp blade, known as a plough in binding terminology. End bands were usually sewn on at the head and the foot of the spine. The outer cover could then be decorated in various ways, most commonly by stamping on heated metal tools, incorporating some kind of engraved design that leaves a permanent impression in the surface of that leather or whatever the skin is on the outside of the board. That's a very high-level summary of a process which is subject to many subtle variations, but those were the basics of the production line which went on in those workshops day in and day out for many centuries. Each binding manifested choices around the materials used, the sturdiness of the end product, and the extent to which it was decorated. And those choices invite us to reflect on the motives that lay behind them. Over time, many bindings were revisited because somebody wanted them to look nicer or easier to identify on a shelf, or because they were well read and they needed repair. And those layers of intervention provide more evidence of interaction with or perceptions of the value of books. But researchers who work with historic books, I think, don't often enough pause to ask those questions of the bindings in front of them, or ask the right questions, partly because they may have little or no training in looking at bindings, and partly because I think we have still yet to completely escape a mindset which has long dominated bookbinding studies, that they're interesting if they are beautiful, and that they're more a subset of art history than book history. And the first question to ask is, who bound it? And I will return to questions of research methodology in my third lecture. Cambridge was, throughout my period, one of three main centres of binding work in England alongside London and Oxford. The two university towns hosted a constant trade in new and second-hand books to meet the needs of learning, and countless books were made and sold in those places. Books bound here in Cambridge will be found in great numbers across the libraries of Cambridge, but also in libraries all over the world, because there has been such a huge international trade in books, in collecting books, moving all over the world. If you know a book was bound in Cambridge and when, you've got some solid information about it likely having been owned and used here. If you can place it within that spectrum of choices between the simple and the sophisticated, which binders, somebody should have shouted at me, you're a slide behind. Sorry, That was the slide of binding techniques that I should have shown when I was talking about them. I didn't press the clicker properly. This is a snapshot of that kind of spectrum of choices that I was talking about, the kinds of bindings which you could commission here in Cambridge around 1625. And if you can place bindings within that kind of spectrum, well, then you can think about the motives behind that particular choice. If you observe that a book was bound here sometime after it was printed, and there are lots and lots of such examples, you can again ask why. Cambridge University Library and many of the college libraries regularly instructed Cambridge binders to rebind books and manuscripts which had been on their shelves for many years, selecting ones which were thought to merit such expenditure, clearly, and neglecting ones which didn't, from which I think we can deduce their perceptions about which books were more read or more likely to be read, and others which maybe weren't. Sometimes they called it right, and sometimes we find 16th century books in Cambridge bindings put on 100 years later, which are battered and much read, but sometimes they seem to have called it wrong, and we find cases like that where the later binding looks almost as new and in as pristine a condition as the day that it was put on. I'll come back to this theme in my third lecture, but I hope you can see that there are opportunities here for intellectual historians to use binding evidence as an indicator of the use and the valuation of books in the past. For all these reasons, therefore, I think it is desirable to have a better and a more comprehensive set of guidance for recognizing and dating Cambridge bindings than we've had hitherto, and that is my main purpose. My book aims primarily to fill that gap, while placing the Cambridge trade in its historical context. And my lectures will summarize my findings partly by giving a historical overview of the development of Cambridge binding styles through the period, and partly by exploring some of the questions which come up along the way. In this first lecture, I will look at the 15th and 16th centuries. In my second, at the 17th and 18th, and in my third, I'll talk about binders, customers, and trade networks. And my starting point in the 15th century has a logic around a general transition in binding techniques that took place around that time. My end point is a rather more arbitrary one, but I'll try and explain that come the next lecture. I am not by any means the first person to study and document Cambridge bookbinding, and I am very much standing on the shoulders of giants or planters of trees, to use Miriam Foot's phrase from her recent Book Collector articles on pioneers of bookbinding history, she being one of those names in that context. Cambridge binding was first seriously written about by George Gray at the beginning of the 20th century. And since then, G.D. Hobson, Basil Oldham, Neil Kerr, Howard Nixon, Graham Pollard, John Oates, Nicholas Hadcraft have all made significant documentary contributions to the study. It is, however, fair to say, I think, that the landscape has been dominated by attention paid to the late 15th and early 16th centuries and the more visually striking work of the early 17th. So the landscape has been studied unevenly, and outside those periods, I think it has been rather neglected, and my aim is to produce a more balanced and a more comprehensive kind of picture. I can't tell you when the first bookbinding in Cambridge was made, but it would probably have been in one of the religious houses which grew up here during the medieval period, alongside the development of the university from the early 13th century onwards. Late medieval bindings, which were intended to last, were commonly made of tawed skin over wooden boards, decorated, if at all, by dyeing the skin, by colouring it, rather than by applying any kind of impressed tooling, because tawed skin doesn't take and hold that kind of tooling very well. This is an example which was made in Cambridge about 1470 for a register of university property. But the generic nature of such bindings, combined with their very low survival rate, does make it difficult to identify them as Cambridge work other than via circumstantial evidence, such as their having been known to be written here. The college libraries, which preserve extensive parts of their medieval libraries, Keys, Pembroke, Peterhouse, for example, ought to be rich reservoirs of such bindings, but alas, the systematic rebinding exercises of the 19th century have swept so much of that kind of thing away. But these are the precursors to my story rather than its starting point, which I take to be the beginning of tanned leather binding work in Cambridge. Across Europe more generally, around the middle of the 15th century, the standard covering material used for bookbindings changed from tawed to tanned skin. Tanning, using tannic acid rather than potassium aluminium sulfate to effect chemical changes in animal skin, produces the kind of harder, shiny leather that we're familiar with today from belts and wallets and shoes and those kinds of things, and it makes a good covering material for bindings. Unlike tawed skin, it will take and hold impressions of metal tools with engraved designs, and when they are heated and stamped on the surface, you are left with a permanent impression, which will survive down the centuries. And because those tools, like everything else in this process, were individually handcrafted by metalworkers skilled in engraving, each one was unique, and it is possible, theoretically at least, to identify and distinguish the impressions which particular tools leave behind, and so to recreate the tool sets of particular binding workshops by observing which ones regularly occur together. This kind of tooled leather binding began to be produced in England in the third quarter of the 15th century. And these are surviving examples made in London and made in Oxford about 1460. The technique seems not to have come to Cambridge quite as early as that, or if it did, the bindings had been lost, and Cambridge was a little late to the game. Graham Pollard, who was fond of making dogmatic statements about binding history, which were, alas, not always completely correct, decided that the magic year was 1482. But I think it may have been a little earlier, perhaps in the mid to late 1470s. I don't think we'll ever be able to pinpoint it exactly. Just observe that the earliest imprints with these kinds of Cambridge bindings date from the early to mid 1470s, though they survive in much greater numbers with imprints of the 1480s and 1490s. This is the era of Cambridge binding work, I think, which has been most extensively documented, and the one to which I have the least to add to what has already been said. Successive generations of binding historians, from Basil Oldham to Graham Pollard and Miriam Foote, have refined and expanded the groups of binding tools and known examples which began to be defined by G.D. Hobson in the 1920s. And I cannot claim to have made any significant new discoveries. There are 6 workshops which have long been identified with groups of tools associated with them, each known by a nickname because the actual names of the people who ran them can't be identified with certainty. The boundaries between these workshops are blurred because although binding historians have long clung to a model of discrete binderies with their own tool sets which they did not share, the reality of the evidence base is rather messier, with some fuzzy edges between broadly consistent groups. And I'll say a little bit more about this when I come to talk about binders in more detail in lecture 3. But suffice to say that I think we should be less fixated on identifying binders than on learning to date and localize Cambridge work and understand it in its contemporary context. My main contribution in this area is actually to reduce Basil Oldham's list of 8 Cambridge workshops to 6, as I think his Athos binder and his Monster binder are too flaky to stay on the list. So I'm left with 6 identified workshops who have left varying numbers of surviving examples behind, from the Demon binder, the one which seems to have been operating earliest, to of which we only have 14 known bindings, to the Unicorn binder and the WG binder, each of whom are known from over 100. Broadly speaking, the output of all these workshops had many similarities, conforming to the conventions of the time in English and European binding work more broadly. A typical binding would be made of tanned calfskin over wooden boards, sewn on split supports of tawed or tanned skin, firmly laced into grooves in the boards with the help of little wooden pegs. They would have 2 clasps run across the foredge, usually made of brass with simple engraved decoration, and they'd have end leaves of plain or recycled parchment. Their covers would be decorated with a series of small hand stamps within a framework of blind lines, typically some kind of diaper or lozenge type design within a surrounding rectangular border. The stamps would be based on standard designs of a kind used all over Northern Europe at the time. So many of the stamps used in Cambridge look not only like each other, but like ones used elsewhere too. Mythical beasts, floral designs, religious symbols, all these things feature regularly. The Unicorn binder gets the name from a stamp depicting a unicorn in the almost in the top left corner there, while the Demon binder from the one in the top left, which shows a 4-legged creature with horns and hooves rearing up on its hind legs, which I forget whether it was Oldham or Hobson who thought it looked like a demon, but that's where the name comes from. In the 1490s, Cambridge binders began to use stamps of what are commonly called lattice or pineapple designs. And again, a very standard design used in many places, but whose Cambridge exemplars are generally sufficiently distinctive to be identifiable when you see them. As I said, I haven't got a lot to say about this period which is new or different or which hasn't been observed before. The tanned calfskin used by Cambridge binders in the late 15th century was often a more reddish brown than the kind of nut browns which you commonly find in Oxford. And it's long been noted that there was a fondness in Cambridge for applying a pink pigment across the covers after the books were finished, a habit which is peculiar to Cambridge and lasted until about 1510, though not practiced by all workshops or binders. The pigment now usually survives only as traces in the more recessed parts of the stamped designs. This is the pinkest example which I have ever seen, which, reproduced as a slide is not actually as pink as it looks in real life, believe me, which does retain the pigment pretty much all over. And this is a book of the 1490s, which is now in Trinity College in Oxford. There were 2 significant labour-saving techniques in binding work which crossed the English Channel around the end of the 15th century to help binders to produce more books more quickly, one of the key motifs of the evolution of bookbinding work through the whole hand press period, the panel stamp and the roll. All the kinds of late 15th century bindings, which I've had on the screen just now, depend on repeated stamping of small tools in order to achieve the cover decoration, and that's labor intensive and takes time. A large rectangular stamp with an engraved design that's big enough to cover one side of a small format book at one go speeds up the process. And the first of these kinds of panel stamps to have been used in England, or the first that we can date with some confidence, was used here in Cambridge in the 1490s. It depicts St. George and the dragon, but all the 3 surviving examples, including the one in the UL here, are sadly worn. The other key innovation was the roll, a brass wheel mounted on a handle with an engraved pattern around the rim, which you can run along the surface of a book, and you obviously get a continuous pattern of ornament without having to repeatedly stamp. The first of these to be used in Cambridge made its appearance in the first decade of the 16th century, roughly the same time as they started to be used in Oxford. And it's associated with someone that we can put a real name to, rather than a nickname, to Garrett Godfrey. He was one of 2 Dutch immigrants who came to Cambridge shortly after 1500 and who became the leading bookseller stationers of the first few decades of the 16th century. The other being Nicholas Spearing, and those 2, together with Seager Nicholson, were the first university stationers to be appointed in 1534. Bindings associated with Godfrey and Spearing have long been known and documented, not least because they had tools which incorporated their initials, GG, etc., or sometimes even their full name, Nicholas Spearing. This kind of labeling of binding tools was not uncommon around this early 16th century period, but not thereafter. There are many hundreds of surviving Godfrey and Spearing binding examples, and Neil Kerr, who began assembling a census of them, the typescript is in the UL, in one of the additional manuscripts, recorded over 300 Godfrey bindings and about 250 Spearing ones. But there are many more than that out there. They had panel stamps for small format books, while quartos and folios would commonly be turned out in bindings looking more like that, using a number of standard patterns. They had single stamps, including pineapple and lattice stamps, which fell out of use about 1520. And in the first quarter of the century, wooden boards and clasps remained the norm for this kind of binding work. I don't want to repeat what has long been documented about those 2 names, ever since George Gray reproduced their binding tools as early as 1904. In the 1980s, the discovery of fragments of Godfrey's customer accounts in a book in Emmanuel College, which fortunately needed taking apart and repair, subsequently edited by Elizabeth Leedham Green, added significantly to our knowledge of Godfrey's operations. What I would say, a point that I will stress more than once, is that our catalogues are full of references to books bound by Garrett Godfrey and bound by Nicholas Spearing, when what we ought to say is bound by a workshop associated with, or something like that. These men could undoubtedly bind books, and I imagine they began their careers doing that for at least some of the time, but in maturity they were businessmen running successful operations, selling books and stationery, and providing binding services which were surely undertaken in the hands-on sense by employees, by apprentices, by family members whose names we are unlikely ever to know. I do think we ought to be more accurate in our terminology and therefore in the mental pictures which it conjures up. Both the Godfrey and the Spearing workshops saw new tools introduced in the 1520s and 1530s, alongside evolution of structural techniques. And one thing we can now do is correct the assertion of Gray and Basil Oldham, which has been followed for too long, that Spearing's binding operation ended in the early 1530s. In fact, it did continue to function until Spearing's death in 1545, but with a mostly new group of tools and rolls and small tools. And that bindery was operating alongside others which can be identified in Cambridge in the second quarter of the 16th century based on new tools which are regularly found in combination, though I can't give you the names of the other workshop managers. What I can talk about are a number of changes which are observable in techniques and materials around that time. Most of the bindings that I've had on screen so far had wooden boards, but from the 1520s onwards, we see increasing use of pasteboard or paste laminate board to adopt the guidance of Legatus as a cheaper and lighter material. You see the change first in small format books, but by the 1560s, folios will regularly also use pasteboard with ties rather than clasps. A noteworthy feature of the 1530s and 40s is the regular use of laminate boards made of compacted sheets of printed waste from printers' shops or recycled books, a tantalizing prospect for bibliographical detectives. Who knows how many unrecorded incunabula lie hidden in these things if you can get past the issues or your conservators involved in taking them apart? Well, I'll leave you to contemplate that one. The use of fragments of cut-up medieval manuscripts was common practice in Cambridge until the 1560s, as it was in Oxford until a little bit later, and there is a vast unexplored reservoir of treasures for fragmentologists in these bindings. The tanned calfskin, which remains the covering material of choice, becomes commonly darker as time goes by, and the practice of folding over and sewing through the head and tail caps, which was standard practice in most English binding work until the 1530s, is replaced by the adoption of exposed end bands at head and foot, sewn around a narrow core, commonly using multicolored thread. Gold tooling on bookbindings by using a very thin layer of gold leaf and a suitable adhesive between the heated binding tool and the leather surface was originally an Islamic technique which came into Europe in the mid to late 15th century and to London around 1520. It was first practiced in Oxford in the early 1560s, and Cambridge sits somewhere in between around 1540. A few bindings associated with late-stage spear ink have a little gold tooling, clearly being used in baby steps, with just a few small tools, gilt-stamped, and some owner's initials. This also represents the beginning of labelling Cambridge bindings with the names or initials of owners, and it's around this time that I've seen the first modest addition of small tools to spines, rather than relying only on lines for spine decoration. There's an interesting and unusual group of Cambridge bindings from the 1530s in the Parker Library in Corpus Christi here, which have wraparound covers or envelope flaps of a kind that we're used to seeing on Islamic bindings, but which are very unusual in English work of this time for printed books rather than for stationary bindings. They're decorated with rolls from both the late spear ink group and the other roll group that was operating around that time. They have manuscript waste paste downs stuck directly onto the leather with no boards as such, and the tooling extends around the envelope, the projecting flap. The books are all medical or medically related, and my guess is that they were made for a Cambridge physician of the time who perhaps found this binding style with flexible but well-protected covers convenient to carry around. At a time when binding work, not only across Cambridge, but in a national and to some extent an international context, conformed so much to standard conventions, which you see everywhere you go, it's the unusual that stands out. And I've not seen anything else quite like this in English work around this time. On the whole, though, the evolution of Cambridge binding work, both in technique and decoration, continued through the 16th century, very much in line with broader trends in English binding work more generally. The kinds of tools and patterns typical of the early part of the century, dominated by rolls and pineapples and all of those kinds of things, gave way in the middle decades to an ornamental vocabulary of what's sometimes called Renaissance or arabesque design, imported originally from the Islamic world through European filters. This pattern, using two impressions of a big fleuron back to back at the center of the to make a central focus, leads smoothly into the centerpiece style, which came to dominate not only Cambridge binding work, but English work more generally through the latter decades of the century. The cover decoration is built up around a single large stamp of elaborate symmetrical design, which may or may not be surrounded by one or more frames. They began to be used in Cambridge around the same time that they started to appear in London and Oxford, sort of early 1560s, something like that. And this is one of the first ones that we know of to be used, applied to a manuscript volume of academic verses, which was presented to Queen Elizabeth on her visitation here in 1564. Thereafter, a number of such tools were in regular use until the end of the century, some more commonly encountered than others, and thousands of bindings were made in Cambridge in the later decades of the 16th century, looking very much like all of these on the screen. Writing about Cambridge centerpiece tools about 20 years ago, I could identify 19 of them. Today, I can list 31, but I suspect that that is not a complete tally. These kinds of bindings are typically, but not invariably, made using very dark brown tanned calfskin. They may or they may not have linen cloth ties and spine decoration, and their leaf edges were often stained yellow. Their end leaf construction doesn't follow one invariable pattern, but it's very common to open them and find an exposed inner board with two fly leaves and stubs, one of printed waste and one of plain paper, with a parchment stub wrapped around the paper leaves, often of manuscript waste. They were certainly used in multiple workshops, centerpiece tools, though a number can certainly be associated with John Shears, who was a successful Cambridge bookseller who died in 1581. There are some further observations which we might make about these centerpiece type bindings. One is that there is a particular tool design shown here, of which 4 closely similar variants were in circulation in Cambridge between the late 1560s and the late 1580s. The design was used elsewhere, but not as commonly, and there is surely an indication here of tool manufacture taking place locally by a Cambridge metalworker. There was a very similar phenomenon in Oxford around the same time, where this design spawned multiple variants and is very strongly associated, particularly with Oxford. Bindings of this kind of pattern could be produced in varying degrees of elaboration, a key principle which applies to binding work of all periods. And at the top end of the scale, bindings like this could be produced, which was made here for a blank book for the brother of the Duke of Norfolk around 1569. Many of the centerpiece tools used in Cambridge were of standard design, standard patterns, which were widely used in variant forms in many other places. But one design which is obviously particular to Cambridge is the one which incorporates the arms of the university, which was much used here in the 1570s and 1580s. There were 3 separate oval tools which fitted within 3 cartouche frames, which sometimes had stamps of the royal arms rather than the arms of the university inserted in the middle. The small oval stamps were sometimes used without the surrounds. Several people have written about these things with conflicting theories as to who used them. My belief is that they were certainly all Cambridge tools, though not all necessarily associated with the same workshop. Though some of them were certainly used by the bindery which was associated with John Shears, and after his death with Thomas, the man who married his widow and who established or re-established printing in Cambridge in the 1580s. They will be found on bindings of all grades, of all parts of the spectrum, from the very simply blind tooled to something in the middle, to the more elaborate gilt-tooled work like the one in the middle there. When Queen Elizabeth visited Cambridge again in the late 1570s, she was presented with a book bound in red velvet. Queen Elizabeth liked her books in textiles, not in leather. If you were giving a book to Elizabeth, you didn't give her a leather-bound one if you knew what you were about. And it was decorated with one of these stamps using the royal arms at the centre rather than the arms of the university. And the book today lives in the Queen's College, Oxford. All the bindings that I have described so far have been solid structures of leather over boards, built to last, and it is important to stress that the book and binding trade in Cambridge included a huge range of more flimsy things, of books and pamphlets taken away in paper or parchment wrappers by people who either couldn't or didn't want to pay for something more solid. Books for student or household books to be read and discarded didn't need to be built to last. Garrett Godfrey's accounts of the late 1520s show that when the coverings of the books were specified, twice as many were in parchment as in leather, and he regularly sold multiple copies of primers and textbooks to schoolmasters in parchment covers for a few pence a copy. Their text blocks may have been properly sewn, they may have been just stab-stitched with a needle and a thread down the side. When the Cambridge bookseller binder John Dennis died in 1578, his probate inventory recorded 329 leather-bound books in his shop, but over 370 either bound in parchment, unbound, or in uncovered pasteboards. If we want to build a complete picture of the circulation and use of books in early modern Cambridge, we do need to remember that many more looked like the ones on the right here than like the ones on the left. The challenge today lies in finding the right-hand ones, because there are several major obstacles to that quest. By their nature, such things were ephemeral or flimsy, and their survival rates from several hundred years ago are very low. When such books do survive, it's often because a later owner put them into more solid covers, discarding the originals. Then we have the problem of the generic nature of such structures, which were made in huge quantities in binding centres all over Europe, without necessarily holding easily recognizable clues as to their place of origin. This is a late 16th century laced case parchment binding, which is typical of so many made around that time. The plain parchment is cut to size, with a little spare to turn in around the edges. The text block is sewn on taut skin supports, run through little holes in the case at the spine folds. The edges and the end bands are undyed, and it has plain paper end leaves. I do believe that this was made in Cambridge because it's a Cambridge imprint. It has the inscription of a contemporary Cambridge owner in it. It lives today in one of the Cambridge College libraries, and I don't believe this book has ever been beyond the borders of Cambridge. But without that kind of circumstantial evidence, rather, as I was saying, for late medieval torn skin bindings, there are no readily observable, no easy fingerprints of Cambridge work. I have found some bindings of this kind which do have more distinctive characteristics. Edmund Jest, who was the Bishop of Salisbury, was a fellow of King's College during the second quarter of the 16th century, and he left his library to Salisbury Cathedral when he died in 1577. It's a wonderful and a well-preserved time capsule of mid-16th century Cambridge binding work, and it includes a number of limp parchment bindings which look like this, rough and ready with four-edge flaps, but otherwise no turn-ins, and fragments from medieval manuscripts wrapped around the first and last gatherings to provide end leaves. More unusually for these kinds of bindings, the text block is sewn on quite broad tanned leather supports, very visible when they're passed through the holes at the spine folds of the case. I have seen another very similar structure in a blank book used to bind the account book used for Jesus College, Cambridge from the late 1550s, and I do think it's likely that these were all made in Cambridge around that time. But I wouldn't go on to say that laced case parchment bindings made in Cambridge then always looked like this, nor would I say that such things with tanned leather supports always indicate Cambridge work. There are, I think, just too many variables in this territory, and this aspect of the Cambridge bookscape is always going to be elusive, I think, as regards surviving evidence. I know that Garrett Godfrey sold many parchment-covered books, and I'm sure that they will have been made in his workshop. I can tell you where to find over 300 Godfrey bindings, but not one of them is bound in parchment. That brings us to the end, pretty much, of the 16th century, which is, I think, a convenient place at which to pause my narrative, not least because I am looking at the clock, in the hope that you are able and willing to join me again tomorrow when I will continue my journey through the 17th and 18th centuries. I will also tomorrow look at some books which allow us to reflect more on the relationships between customers and binders, and to see more of those spectrum of choices around quality and cost in action.